Our story takes place in the studio of Flemish artist Peter Paul Rbens as follows. One day, while the pupils were crowding around a freshly painted picture by the master Peter Paul Rbens, the young Diepenbeck, who was the atelier monitor, accidentally pushed against it so that the arm and chin of the Virgin were rubbed out. The young men stood aghast with alarm, and at last one of them cried out, "Fetch Van Dyck! He is the ablest of us. Let him try to repair the damage." With much hesitation, Anthony set about the work, and in 2 or 3 hours he finished it so successfully that even Rbens himself was at first deceived, and believed that it was his own handiwork. When he perceived that another brush than his own had been engaged upon it, he summoned the pupils together, and won from them a frank confession of the accident, with which he was so well pleased and amused that he forthwith forgave the offenders. The young Van Dyck was vindicated, and his attempts not unnoticed to step up and fix the situation admirably. In the heroic city of Antwerp, on the 22nd of March 1599, Anthony van Dyck first saw the light. His father, Francis van Dyck, was a wealthy silk merchant and had inherited a thriving business from his ancestors, who were all men of Antwerp. Anthony would be the 7th child of 12 children born to his second wife, Mary Kuipers. She was also a gifted weaver and designer, so encouragement for the young one was not unexpected. When the child had shown talent, his mother persuaded his father to place him in the studio of Henry van Balen, a meritorious historical painter who had been a fellow disciple of Rbens and had perfected his art by studying in Italy. According to the registers of the Guild, Anthony van Dyck passed under the tuition of Van Balen in 1609, when he was but 10 years old. At the expiration of 4 or 5 years, he made an attempt to be enrolled among the great master's pupils, and his aspirations were warmly seconded by his wise parents. He had the good fortune to meet with the approval of Rbens, who freely admitted him to the studio. He soon promoted him to the duty of making miniature drawings from his own great paintings, which, since they were to be used for the engravers to work upon, needed to reproduce the subtlest expressions of those famous works. That Van Dyck was highly esteemed by his fellow pupils, as well as by the master, is proven by the role he played in assisting his teacher. Rbens was accustomed, after the labours of the day were over, to mount his horse and ride out into the country, to unwind the tension of his duties and to seek fresh sources of inspiration. Van Dyck had now grown his wings and was ready to fly. Precociousness had given place to adolescent maturity. At the age of 21, the painter is ready to take his place among the great artists of the world. It is easy to form a picture of the youthful Van Dyck's appearance at this age, since throughout life he was his own model or sitter on several occasions. In a number of works there is a portrait of a youth, evidently by Van Dyck, in which his own features can be discerned. A fresh and delicate face, well-formed features, the nose and chin well-shaped, the mouth somewhat opulent, though obstinate in character. Light chestnut-coloured hair falling in waving clusters over his forehead and about his ears, a suggestion of a delicate rather than a virile type. Such are the general characteristics of the face, which altered but little during his lifetime. He was short of stature and of a slender figure. His hand was long and sensitive, with straight fingers almost parallel to each other, a hand which is easy to recognise, which no doubt shows up in many of his sitters' portraits in place of their own. Van Dyck betrays a nervous and obstinate disposition. He has been described as ambitious, quick to learn, and able to assimilate the ideas of others. Never quite content with or confident in his own supreme genius for portrait painting, ever ready to receive some new passion in painting. Luxurious in his life, but at the same time strongly individual, proud and sensitive, quick to feel a slight or take offence, and careless of giving offence to others. With such traits in his character, Van Dyck presents a strong contrast to his master Rbens and his other Flemish friends and contemporaries. It was not likely that so uneasy a spirit would remain long in a position of inferiority or subordination as an apprentice. A suitable exit from Rubens' studio was provided for Van Dyck by an English lady, Alethea Talbot, wife of Thomas, Earl of Arundel, who is renowned throughout the history of art as one of the greatest amateurs and art patrons that have ever existed. Arundel was well known in the Netherlands and had already had dealings with Rubens. He may himself have noticed the young Van Dyck, but there is nothing more recorded. In June 1620, the Countess of Arundel left England intending to take her 2 sons to Italy for their education. However, she arrived in Antwerp and made some arrangements to stay there, in order that a double portrait of her husband and herself might be painted by the great Rubens. It is clear that her husband Arundel did not accompany her, for on July 17th one of her group wrote to the Earl from Antwerp. And it should be noted here that Rubens became less interested in straightforward portrait work and expressed his feelings. "I have refused to execute the portraits of many princes and noblemen, especially of his lordship's rank. Yet from the Earl I am bound to receive the honour which he does me in commanding my services, regarding him, as I do, in the light of an evangelist to the world of art, and the great supporter of our profession." It is at this point that she becomes aware of Van Dyck and would be a patron and the key person to make his introduction to important English clientele. So it happened that after Rubens recommends his star pupil, he writes, "I assure the Countess that he will paint no person, unless by your lordship's recommendation." Van Dyck is always with Signor Rubens, and his works are beginning to be scarcely less esteemed than those of his master. He is a young man of 21, with a father and mother in this city who are very rich, so it is difficult for him to quit these parts, all the more because he sees the fortune which Rubens is enjoying. It is evident from this letter that the Earl and Countess of Arundel were persons of great importance in the eyes of Rubens, and that their attention had been drawn to his brilliant young assistant. The portrait of the Earl and Countess of Arundel, with their dwarf, fool, and dog, is now in the Royal Gallery at Munich. It is clear that her husband Arundel did not accompany her, for on July 17th one of her group wrote to the Earl from Antwerp. Having received the preliminary sketches by Rubens referred to in this letter, it is assumed Rubens handed over a section to Van Dyck to complete. Thus, in sending the picture to Arundel in England for approval, may have been responsible for the next important event in the life of Van Dyck, his first visit to England, in which it is clear that Arundel was concerned about the arrogance of Van Dyck. The next piece of information comes from Sir Dudley Carleton, the friend and correspondent of Rubens, who seems to have commissioned Toby Matthew, a well-known political agent, to obtain some artwork painting by Van Dyck. Then, by 1620, we have the word, saying, "Your lordship will have heard how Van Dyck, his famous allievo, or student in English, is gone into England, and that the king hath given him a pension of £100 per annum." It is evident from Matthew's letter that this fellow, even at the age of 21, was by no means an easy person to deal with. Painting in England was not an indigenous art. Artists were summoned there from other countries. Holbein, for example, had for a few years figured at the court of Henry VIII, and rendered it immortal. In the latter part of the 16th century, the artists chiefly employed by the court and nobility came from the Netherlands, who brought over with them the traditions of the Spanish court, with its stiff portraits at whole length in rich costumes, such as were painted in Spain and in the Netherlands by Anthony Moore and Purbus. England did not afford a field for artists of the first rank, and the painting of costume, armour, and other accessories tended to occupy the primary interest of the portrait, to the exclusion of the likeness. This is especially to be noticed in the portraits of Queen Elizabeth, who may have enjoined the practice upon those who were allowed to paint her likeness. The Queen is known to have had her views on portrait painting, as well as on politics or religion. Van Dyck probably required some financial security assurances before he left his prosperous quarters at Antwerp. Hence the king was induced by Arundel to give the young painter a pension as a member of the royal household. The visit to England was, however, but a short one, and it is uncertain how Van Dyck was employed. James was not a connoisseur of painting, like his sons Henry and Charles, but he liked having his portrait painted. Nothing more is known of Van Dyck's first visit to England. He probably painted the portrait of his patron, the Earl of Arundel, perhaps the noble seated portrait now in the collection of the Duke of Sutherland at Stafford House. Van Dyck may have been disappointed at the employment given him by the king. He seems to have insisted upon having his pension of £100 paid down to him at once, and in its entirety to emulate the fame and fortune of Rbens. He informed Arundel of his wish to follow in his master's footsteps and complete his education as a painter in Italy. Arundel may have, on the strength of this, obtained the king's leave for Van Dyck to be absent for 8 months, and furthermore an advance of the painter's whole pension for the year. It would seem under any circumstances that the king expected him to return. Van Dyck returned to his native city of Antwerp as the servant of a king, and it is improbable that he resumed his place in the studio of Rbens. His visit to England was not entirely without effect, for some influence of the painter Van Sommer can be traced in the portraits which can be attributed to the next few months' paintings, especially in the landscapes introduced into the backgrounds. Van Dyck is said to have visited on his way back both Paris and The Hague, but there is no evidence to support this. He probably returned straight to Antwerp, and if no longer willing to act as an assistant to Rbens, it may have been during the next few months that he painted the various copies, for Rbens' portraits too were no doubt greatly in demand. Proof of his intimacy with Rbens and his household is shown by the remarkable portrait that Van Dyck painted of Rbens's first wife, Isabella Brandt, which is in the Hermitage Gallery in St. Petersburg. This portrait contains a view of the great arch and portico which formed the approach to the house of Rbens through the garden. Scandal has not hesitated to suggest, on the slightest possible grounds, that the charming young painter seemed to Rbens to be too much of an attraction to the lively Isabella, and that for that reason Rbens did his best to hasten the projected journey of Van Dyck to Italy. The 8 months' leave accorded to Van Dyck by James I had actually expired before the painter really set forth upon his travels. Rbens was himself about to start, if he had not already done so, for that journey to Paris which resulted in the famous series of paintings done for Queen Marie de Medicis in the Palais de Luxembourg. The two painters parted on affectionate terms. Van Dyck painted a portrait of himself and Rbens together, which he presented to his master, in addition to the portrait of Isabella Brandt and other paintings from his hand. Rbens in return is said to have given Van Dyck the best horse in his stables, and Rbens was no mean judge of horses. Van Dyck would now find his way to travel to Italy. He found Titian and the masters on October 3rd, 1621. He left Antwerp in company with Cavaliere Giovanni Nani, a Venetian by birth and a friend of Rbens. They spent a few days at Brussels, and thence proceeded to Genoa, the port city, and the capital of northwest Italy's Liguria region, is known for its central role among the great maritime centres of commercial activity. Both at Genoa and at Venice, there was a large colony of merchants from the Netherlands and Germany. Many young artists, who found their native city overstocked with men, as competent or more successful than themselves, thought it profitable to move to some place like Genoa, where they would find a sufficient number of their compatriots to ensure employment and reward. Rbens had spent some time at Genoa about 20 years before, and the memory of his presence there would ensure a hearty welcome to one so strongly recommended by Rbens as Van Dyck. Among his compatriots, therefore, Van Dyck would feel himself to be no stranger in Italy. His mind was already full of the wondrous creations and Paolo Veronese, which he had seen in the house of Rbens. His impressionable nature lent itself readily to the influence of Italy and Italian art. The merchant princes of Genoa provided in their palaces plenty of material for the youthful artist to study and admire. Although it was the ambition of Van Dyck to excel as a painter of history, and the journey to Italy was undertaken with this objective in mind. However, the reason that he obtained the ways and means for obtaining his goal was by portrait work. During his first short stay at Genoa, he likely painted some portraits of his fellow countrymen, which combine the true and unmistakable manner of the Flemish school, with something of the noble dignity and rich colouring of the Italian artists. The paintings of sacred history, mythology, romance, and other historical subjects enumerated in the Van Dyck's portfolio of works would suffice for the career of any ordinary painter, especially as that list does not pretend to be exhaustive. But Van Dyck was no ordinary painter. His command of the technical side of his art was complete, and the facility and rapidity of his production have seldom, if ever, been equalled, taking into consideration the extremely high quality and finish of his work at this period. While striving with, by no means unqualified success, to outrival Rbens as a historical and decorative painter, Van Dyck was at the same time engaged upon that side of his art in which he, without question, reigned supreme, is that of portrait painting. A review of the portraits painted by Van Dyck during the 5 or 6 years that elapsed between his return from Italy and his removal to England makes it almost impossible to believe that the same man should have had time to paint these and the important large pictures ascribed to him. A keen eye, an acute and subtle intelligence, a precise and lucid mind, and a sure and accurate hand, all of these contributed to Van Dyck's success. There is no bungling or hesitation, no timidity, no excess or deficiency in Van Dyck's portrait work. It is the art of a consummate workman, a complete master of his craft, without any inclination to stretch it beyond its limits, and at the same time a man of commanding individuality. This is the more remarkable because in all his previous work Van Dyck had shown feverish energy and susceptibility to emotions and influence from without, which he now seems to have outgrown. One notable feature of Van Dyck's portraits at maturity is their austerity. Black and white prevail in them, in the skirts and mantles of the women, as in the cloaks and jerkins of the men. It is this negation of colour as the be-all and end-all of portraiture which enhances Van Dyck's portraits as types of character, and the colour is not missed. All of it works together as a unit wholly satisfying. Van Dyck lived like a prince in his house at Blackfriars. His biographer, in the supplement to Die Pijl, says that he always went magnificently dressed, had a numerous and gallant equipage, and kept so noble a table in his apartment that few princes were more visited or better served. Hard work in the morning and rich banquets with fair ladies and joyous courtiers in the evening formed the daily routine of the fashionable painter. Musicians played when royalty was present in the studio. His expenses were great, and it was only by his work that he was able to meet them. When the affairs of his royal patrons began to be embarrassed, and money ceased to flow as freely from the royal coffers, Van Dyck found that the debts owed him by the king, as well as his pension, were often in arrears. It is evident that the king did not always approve of the charges made by the painter, since he with his own hand amended the prices asked by Van Dyck on the memorandum so often referred to. It is said that one day the king, while sitting to Van Dyck, discussed with the Earl of Arundel, who was present, the financial difficulties of the crown, and turning to the painter, asked him if he knew what it was to be in want of money. "Yes, sir," replied the painter. "If one keeps an open table for one's friends, and an open purse for one's mistresses, one soon comes to the bottom of one's coffer." Women were the fatal attraction of Van Dyck's life, and on them he wasted his health and his money. One fair siren by the name of Margaret Lemon ruled him and his house, and was painted by him more than once. She appears in a portrait at Hampton Court, which is evidently based on the well-known Magdalen by Titian, and again in a saucy portrait known from an engraving, the original of which cannot be traced. Van Dyck painted her also as Judith holding a sword. Virtue notes in his diaries that it was wondered by some that knew him that having been in Italy he could keep a mistress of his in his house, and suffer his brother to keep her company. Throughout life, Van Dyck shows considerable voracity for money, but it was not from greediness, so much as to enable him to maintain the costly and luxurious lifestyle. It is clear that the renowned painter, Sir Anthony van Dyck, could not live a life of such luxury and splendour, and at the same time devote himself with unabated zeal to the practice of his art. He began more and more to leave portions of the work to his assistants and to adopt the position held by Rbens in the latter's great working atelier at Antwerp. This he would seem to have done himself at Antwerp before he came to settle in England. The last portrait that Van Dyck painted of himself is probably that in which he is pointing to a sunflower. Clad in a suit of rich crimson silk, the painter is seen to the waist, turned to the right and looking at the spectator. With his left hand he draws out and displays the gold chain of honour which the king had bestowed upon him, and with his right he points to a sunflower. What is the allegory of this painting? Van Dyck would seem to suggest that as the sunflower turns its face to the sun, as the latter crosses the heavens, so does the painter's art depend upon the warmth of the patronage which may be extended to it, while mere payment in gold does not affect it so much as the continuing rays of royal favour. This portrait is known from many versions, most of them repetitions by his pupils. It was engraved by W. Holler soon after Van Dyck's death. In the era that produced an artist like that of Van Dyck, we find an interesting and noteworthy consideration. It's been stated that from the proud and lofty nature of Austrian and Spanish princes and dignitaries came lavish and magnificent declarations in its patronage. The arts were by no means the least to profit from this, and the genius of Rbens thus found very lucrative support, as a short time later did the kindred spirits of Velasquez and Van Dyck. At Antwerp, painting was regarded as one of the most honourable trades. Its guild, that of St. Luke, was among the foremost in the city. Given natural gifts of industry and talent, it was as likely for a youth to turn his mind towards painting as a trade as towards any other more recognised branches of a commercial career. At that date, the burgher families of a city like Antwerp seldom looked for their helpmates in life beyond the walls of their city, and the sons and daughters of artists intermarried freely with those of the mercers, wine merchants, notaries, and the like. There were probably few families who did not rank one or more artists, if not in their own circle, at all events within that of their relatives, so that a hereditary disposition to art was easily acquired and widely disseminated. Among the busy merchants at Antwerp in the middle of the 16th century trades thrived, and it would seem quite clear that Van Dyck was never in any way a pupil or apprentice of Rbens. There is no evidence to show that, among the host of young artists working in the schools of Van Balen and others, the boy Van Dyck had been singled out for notice by the great painter, their ideal monarch, until the exhibition of the Series of Apostles in Verhagen's gallery. Van Dyck's early admission to the Guild of St. Luke shows that he was looked upon as a finished painter. Rbens himself did not keep a painting school for youths. What he required was a number of skilled assistants to aid in the work of the vast picture manufactory over which he presided. In the great house, which Rbens built for himself at Antwerp, he divided his work, as it would appear, between a special studio of his own, to which no one was admitted, and one or more large studios, in which his assistants were engaged on drawing out or laying the colour of those vast decorative compositions, sacred and profane, with which the name of Rbens is usually associated. It was the practice of Rbens at the zenith of his career to make a sketch of his composition in lightly coloured monochrome. This was handed to his assistants, who then drew it out on the canvas according to the required scale, and laid in the colours to a greater or lesser extent as the master directed. The paintings were in most cases actually finished or corrected by the master's own hand. Rbens, in his letters to Sir Dudley Carleton and others, is careful to distinguish between the paintings which were wholly the work of his own hands, or chiefly that of his assistants and finished by him, or really carried out by his assistants. Van Dyck in later years would utilise a similar approach, benefiting the master and youths that aspire to learn a trade. Van Dyck made the most of his short life, and we are the beneficiaries of seeing his productions. We hope you enjoyed this look at the life of Anthony van Dyck as much as we did, in looking more closely to understand the man and his contributions to art. Thank you to those of you who have already subscribed, and we hope to add more to our channel. Please leave a like, and we will see you next time. So bye for now. Van Dyck, the Prince of Portraiture.